Thank you for inviting me to speak and for keeping to the dance of rescheduling that we've had to do via COVID, and most recently for shifting this over to Zoom so that I could share video with sound with you guys. I'm aware that it caused some hiccups, but I'm glad we can share that in full. I also thank the Istituto di Studi Avanzati and the University of Bologna for having me. And to all of you here, I see familiar faces, and it's really great to see that for coming. I'm excited to share my work, and I look forward to discussing it with you all. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to share the screen here, and so you can see the slides that I'm drawing.
Sorry,
on.
Josh, just a question, because I can't record because the system says I have to ask you. Yeah, so if you can for us, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll get that to you. So, okay. So as Antonella mentioned, my talk is called Resurrecting a Spectacular Hero, Dirilis Ertuğrul, Necropolitics, and Popular Culture in Turkey. And I'd like to just start with a video. And I invite you to listen to the first few seconds of this especially.
Ya Rab, seni kendime vekil yapıyor. Azametin karşısında yüzümü yere sürüyor. Ve senin uğrunda savaşıyorum.
In February of 2017, a commercial appeared on the website of government TV channel TRT and another channel as well. The ad, which features a host of famous Turkish leaders, makes direct reference to the July 2016 coup attempt and casts President Erdogan as the obvious successor to those who carried the nation through difficult times. The ad was part of a campaign to encourage voters to support the shift to a presidential system of government. Among the leaders in the ad is Ertuğrul Gazi, the father of Osman, who would go on to found the Ottoman dynasty. Ertuğrul is not well known historically, making him an outlier in a docket including the likes of Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent and Abdülhamid II. But his inclusion in this list was no accident. He's the title character in TRT's smash hit serial Resurrection Ertuğrul, or Dirilis Ertuğrul, which began in 2014 and finished in 2019. It's a saga that traces his leadership of the Kaya tribe westward to the present-day Turkey, amidst conflicts with enemies such as Mongols and Knights Templar. Thus, while little is known about the historical Ertuğrul, the TRT character is recognized and beloved across Turkey. The referendum ad begins with a throaty croon, that was the sound I was calling your attention to, that Resurrection viewers will easily peg as a soundbite from the serial's theme song, dispelling any doubt that popular culture and history have been blended for political purposes. Such blending has been widespread under Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, or AKP, but its stakes are not well understood. Today, I trace some of the ways in which resurrection has been used instrumentally by the AKP government, blurring traditional distinctions between entertainment, history, and policy. After providing brief context for the serial, I introduced the notion of prescriptive activation to describe the extra-textual use of media text by those in power. Next, I turned to the trappings of death that surround resurrection, suggesting that the serial partakes in a representational necropolitics that fetishize death for the nation. And then I explore the stakes of such representation, turning to a case in which text-inspired and literal necropolitics converge. I end on a speculative note, looking to the ways in which media-bolstered Turkish necropolitics may be expanding its territory. So just to provide some brief context, resurrection is part of a much greater trend in which Turkish TV has been courting audiences in Turkey with representations of the past. This includes, broadly speaking, two rather different targets, the Republican past and the Ottoman or Neo-Ottoman past. There are key differences between these targets and the kinds of struggles they excite, and I'll be happy to say more about that topic later if you're interested. Though the Republican-themed serials are fascinating, I've spent my time exploring the success and failure of the Ottoman-themed shows, most notably Rebellion, which was a government attempt that resulted in consummate failure. The various Ottoman serials can be seen as a reaction in some ways to the success of Magnificent Century, which was very popular, but also excited great anger. So this show ran from 2011 to 2014, and it was replaced by Resurrection, but there are great differences between the two shows. I suggest that Century elicited these reactions, in part because it circulated within a current of relatively reflective nostalgia, breaking taboos on sacred figures, while other serials failed because they attempted to respect those taboos, partaking in what Svetlana Boym has termed restorative nostalgia. And in the larger project, these two terms, reflective and restorative nostalgia, are central, although they're not so central to this project. In terms of controversy, Century came under attack from none other than then Prime Minister Erdogan, now president. In November of 2012, Erdogan was concerned, among other things, with the lack of time that Century's Suleiman spent on horseback. So it may come as little surprise that the government's later effort, Resurrection, features many scenes on horseback. The show has been a huge success, and in a related paper, I suggest this is because the producers have picked a character who's little known to history and thus subject to fewer taboos. This freedom was coupled with marked improvements in creative team, cast, and crew to make Resurrection a stronger all-around production than in previous efforts. Such investment led the serial to a solid premiere season in 2014 and to runaway success in subsequent seasons, where it topped ratings and often broke records for audience shares in excess of 40%. The government's investment in the show wasn't just financial, though, nor was it limited to the realm of popular culture. Indeed, evoking Resurrection for political purposes began soon after the series premiered. In January of 2015, for example, when President Erdogan greeted Azerbaijani President Aliyev outside the new palace in Ankara, the band played the Resurrection theme song. The upbeat tune has since become ubiquitous at both government and AKP-sponsored events, where it's used to rally crowds. But let's just play a second here. So those of you who were here before will begin to recognize this theme song, and we'll hear it again before the presentation is over. But music is far from the only use of Resurrection by the government. On the 29th of May, 2016, for example, Turkey celebrated its 563rd anniversary of the conquest of Istanbul with a ceremony attended by President Erdogan. The theme for the event, Resurrection Again, Rising Again, Yeniden Dirilish, Yeniden Yükseliş, evoked the serial's name, and two of the special guests were actors from the show. Cengiz Joksun and Nurettin Sönmez took stage in full costume to reprise their roles as Turgut Alp and Bamsi Beyrek, two of Ertuğrul's closest confidants. The anachronism of 13th century characters on parade at the celebration of a 15th century conquest may be striking, but it's entirely in keeping with a restorative nostalgic outlook that partakes in what Edward Said has called one of the key tropes of Orientalism, the notion of a timeless East. Indeed, the message Coşkun and Sönmez delivered was, much like the political ad with which I began, one of continued Turkish dominance from the ancient past to the present. These examples provide some taste of how Resurrection is used by the government for purposes well beyond the realm of entertainment. But how can one best characterize this would-be repurposing of popular culture? I'm not here addressing the kind of political message contained within the text. Like most popular serials in Turkey, and indeed probably to a far greater extent than many, Resurrection is rife with political commentary on contemporary Turkey. But here I'm instead interested in the extra-textual ways that Resurrection is brought forth to engage a public, because I believe they may shift the effective relationship people have with the text to other purposes. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle approaches this issue. For Debord, our everyday lives are increasingly overtaken by spectacles, leading to questions about the nature of reality that have strong political implications. While Debord's spectacle was preoccupied with eradicating historical knowledge in general, we might consider the ways in which history is subsumed rather than eradicated by spectacle. Jonathan Crary has tied Debord's spectacle to Foucault's notion of discipline, and it's in line with Crary's understanding that I offer the notion of the prescriptive activation of a text. I base this loosely on what Tony Bennett has called the productive activation of a text by readers and viewers. While Bennett's productive activation is quite useful for ethnographic work on textual publics, I here focus on the government's purposeful use of the text and advance the concept of prescriptive activation, the extra-textual attempt by a producer to activate the text among its public in particular ways. For those primarily interested in media studies, I think this notion is the key intervention I'll make tonight, as it provides us with a handle of sorts to grasp emergent forms of world-making in transmedia storytelling, particularly those working at political ends. Events at the rallies I mentioned above are useful to provide some clarification. When the Turkish government sponsors a rally that includes the Resurrection theme song and actors who make clear reference to their roles in the show, this is a prescriptive activation because the government is guiding members of the public towards an understanding of the text and its greater social significance. When the fans at these rallies bring and wave the blue flags bearing the E symbol ascribed to the Kaya tribe, and this right behind me here is an example of those flags, and they're ubiquitous at such rallies. This is in line with Bennett's productive activation because agency rests with the viewer or the participant. Both of these activities can be said to blur some of the lines between entertainment, history, and politics, partaking in the society of the spectacle described by Debord. One question this raises, particularly in the case of prescriptive activation, is what direction does this guidance take? What is the government doing by foisting this show into the public well beyond the purview of its primetime TV slot? The title of the series is one indicator, Resurrection. Before tackling the broader significance of this title, it's worth noting a paired set of meanings that are clear to those viewing the serial in Turkey. First, the title is a reference to the story arc of the central character. Though relatively little is known about the historical Ertuğrul, the series plot includes the near complete destruction of his Kaya tribe by Mongols and Ertuğrul's subsequent rise to leadership. This is just one of numerous resurrections that Ertuğrul and his people go through over the course of the serial. In a similar vein, the slogan from the 29 May celebrations cited above, resurrection again, rising again, and you can see in the slide the Turkish there, suggests the show parallels the AKP's rise to power. The resurrection here is thus intertwined with contemporary politics, specifically the idea that the AKP represents the resurrection of Turkish greatness, that Erdogan is Ertuğrul. Or, as I argue in the larger paper, Ertuğrul is Erdogan, since the sparse historical notation leaves much room for AKP improvisation. But why is resurrection the key process at work? Both the serial and the government insist on this terminology. I believe that the frequent and public use of both the term resurrection and the serial resurrection by the AKP is symptomatic of a broader necropolitics in Turkey, a fascination with and championing of death on behalf of the nation that has stark implications for everyday life, politics, and even the nature of democracy practiced there. In his pioneering theorization of necropolitics, it's this one actually, Achille Mbembe draws on Foucault's biopower to offer an understanding of politics, sovereignty, and subjectivity that looks not to reason, but instead to the poles of life and death, and who wields the power to determine them. As he puts it, my concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. For Mbembe, slavery and colonialism are key instances of historical necropolitics, while the occupation of Palestine, characterized by territorial fragmentation and siege warfare, is a clear contemporary example. As an aside, let me note that I recently finished reading Banu Bargu's new edited collection, Turkey's Necropolitical Laboratory, and it provides a host of excellent discussions about the broader trend of necropolitics in contemporary Turkey. Though it covers a striking array of topics, it doesn't touch on the mediation of necropolitics in popular culture, and that's where I'll turn for my first pass at necropolitics. Mbembe is concerned with a literal politics of physical death, and this is a point I'll return to. But for the moment, I'm interested in a representational politics of death, a normalization, spectacularization, and even celebration of death in everyday life, chiefly by means of media. These ultimately serve to foster what Raymond Williams calls a structure of feeling, a kind of emergent culture of a period. And I think resurrection is clearly implicated in this kind of necropolitics. In late February of 2015, a few months after the show premiered, Turkish troops crossed into Syria to recover personnel and artifacts from the tomb of Süleyman Shah. One soldier was killed in the operation. Süleyman is Ertuğrul's father in the serial, and perhaps also historically, though this is less clear. In the TRT version of history, he's the patriarch of the Kaya tribe, a key figure of reverence, and though he dies towards the end of season 1, he continues to visit characters in memories and visions in subsequent seasons. The full paper explores the political context for this raid, noting that the government had likely considered using the tomb for political purposes in the lead up to municipal elections in 2014, but ultimately it did not. While Süleyman Shah's tomb was only a footnote to the 2014 municipal ballot, it was front and center a year later, however, as the AKP faced its most serious political challenge to date in the June 2015 parliamentary vote. On the night of 21 February, close to 600 Turkish troops entered Syria through the Kurdish-held town of Kobane, with tanks and other armored vehicles. They evacuated the Süleyman Shah enclave, which housed 38 Turkish soldiers at the time, took all articles of historical interest, and destroyed the remainder of the site to prevent its use by the Islamic State. One soldier died in the operation under circumstances that are still not clear, though there's never been suggestion of hostile fire. A new tomb was constructed just across the border from Turkey, near the Syrian village of Ashme. The pro-AKP media declared the operation Shah Euphrates a stunning success, with such fanfare that some media critics compared it to a Hollywood production. Main opposition parties, however, critiqued both the loss of territory and the cooperation with Syrian Kurdish forces that the operation presumably entailed. One key difference between the 2014 attempt and the 2015 success was that the media environment had changed considerably. By February of 2015, Süleyman Shah had become a household name in Turkey, thanks to the popularization of the character on Resurrection. The tomb and its defense became increasingly relevant at a popular level when the ancient character associated with them was fleshed out and brought to life on a weekly basis. The spectacle here is twofold: popular TV serial on the one hand, media frenzy over a military operation on the other, all in the midst of an election season. At the level of necropolitics, it is not simply the focus on a long-dead hero and his resting place that are of interest. These are in keeping with a baseline nationalism that is common to many countries. Rather, the apparent willingness to consider attacking one's own country, and excluding that, the theater of putting 600 lives at risk for a tomb that literally raise the person's remains from the ground attests to a politics steeped in death on both ends of the historical divide. As an aside, let me note that this operation provides a counterpoint to what Bargu and some others in the edited book have called necropolitical violence, those acts that target the dead bodies of those killed in armed conflict. What I see with the Süleyman Shah tomb is the Janus face of such violence, and it might rather be called necropolitical reverence, referring to acts that make use of the dead bodies of national heroes. Returning to the raid, ultimately the government either put the lives of many soldiers at risk for negligible gains, or pretended to do so while denying political coordination and touting the danger and bravery of the operation. we're faced with a necropolitics that is either representational or literal in terms of the present danger, and grave-diggingly real in terms of the past. Regardless of intention, one soldier died in the operation, making the theater of death quite concrete for at least one family. This was not the only case where resurrection would be called upon to mediate necropolitics. Starting the day after the 15th of July coup in 2016 and continuing for 23 days, the Turkish government sponsored a series of events that it called Democracy Watches, Demokrasi Nöbetleri, nightly public rallies in squares across the country where citizens would gather to demonstrate in support of democracy and to honor those who had died thwarting the coup. The timbre of these watches ranged from solemn to festive, but with greater balance on the latter end. Lively music, flag waving, vibrant MCs, myriad politicians and celebrities were all part of the mix. Many of the events were staged for camera and broadcast across Turkey. They featured large crews and an infrastructure that included multiple stages, numerous giant screens, and camera cranes. The Resurrection March and the Erdogan anthem Dombra were the repeated soundtracks of these events, each played well over 10 times per night. Resurrection was also present in the form of myriad blue EE flags, which overlooked the crowd alongside Turkish flags, Erdogan flags, Azerbaijani flags, and occasionally Ataturk flags. And this will give you some sense of the atmosphere at these watches.
Üstadımıza devredeceğim. Bir radyocu olarak, bir radyocu kardeşiniz olarak şu dakika itibariyle radyocuların artık üstadı diyoruz biz ona. Siz onu gezegen Mehmet olarak tanıyorsunuz. Sevgili üstadım, sevgili abim, ben sahneye davet etmek istiyorum.
The serial was further represented by its actors, who made frequent appearances at these events, exciting the crowd with messages about sacrifice and the honor of the nation. Lead actor Engin Altan Düzaytan, for instance, returned from vacation abroad to address the crowd in Üsküdar, Istanbul, on the 25th of July, where he appeared alongside 4 cast members and the writer for the show to assure those assembled that he never had and never would lose faith in his homeland, nation, or government. This is Düzaytan here and in the promotion for the show. Mehmet Çevik, who played the crazy ironsmith or Deli Demirci on the show, appeared in at least 2 watches in the weeks after the coup to deliver long speeches about his sense of honor at seeing how the nation had responded. In both speeches, he referred to the plotting from outside that Turks have faced throughout history, tying the travails of the Kaya tribe to the greatness of the Ottomans and to the challenges of Çanakkale or Gallipoli, and linking these all to the moments of the coup. Çevik used his role as actor, playing a key fictional figure in the Kaya tribe, to speak with a kind of popular authority on the history of the Turkish past. His register was highly dramatic when doing so, and the appeals of this unique blend of celebrity, character, and citizen blur to some degree what might otherwise be more distinct lines between history and present, fiction and fact, politics and patriotism. He used his stage to call out the bravery of those who jumped in front of tanks, and in a clear reference to those killed in the coup, he noted that in one speech, the graves in the ground are what define a homeland. It's in remarks like these that we see most clearly the valorization of death and its ties to the greater national project. Though graves had not even been dug at the time of the first Democracy Watch, a symbol of the dead was incorporated very quickly into the architecture of the squares. In at least 2 of the venues, Taksim at the center of Istanbul and the Yenikapı Assembly Field, where the final watch took place, a giant billboard listing the names of those killed in the coup, the martyrs or şehitler as they're called in Turkey, was positioned alongside the stage and the screens. In the government narrative, the names are there to be honored, and also serve as a reminder of the costs of democracy. Various speakers evoked the martyrs, often tying them like Çevik to other historical sacrifices made by Turks. And yet the overriding tenor of the watches was not one of somber reverence for the dead, but rather celebration and solidarity. Nor were these dead, ever present in name, long the center of attention. In each of the cases I've mentioned, the Wall of Martyrs was possession near the stage, but its static list of names was no competition for contemplation next to large screens and the host of celebrities occupying center stage. Both in terms of architecture and ceremony then, the dead were brought next to the living and made part of everyday life. Their memory was present, but in this setup, it was the likes of Çevik who prescriptively activated this memory as part of a greater Turkish story. At the watches, the dead were collectively narrativized by the living. They were used in a theater that had far more to do with politics than individuals and remembrance of their lives. This isn't to suggest that the dead were denied ceremonies of memorial. It's simply to show that they were used how they were used at the watches. The role of resurrection in this theater wasn't subtle. Its ever-present music lent to the festival feel. Its flags waved energetically amidst the crowd, and its actors told stories that shaped the deaths into meaning. What I see with these activations of resurrection is an extension of necropolitics into the realm of popular culture. Returning to Membe's formulation, a state of exception is key to the necropolitical order, and the democracy watches were part of the greater theater that was used to justify a literal state of emergency in which laws were suspended and power was further concentrated under Erdogan for 2 years. The political ad with which I began was released amidst this state of emergency, and the constitutional referendum it supported was, likewise, voted under the same conditions. Erdogan reaped unprecedented powers as a result of his victory in the referendum and ultimately the election of 2018, which saw him confirmed as the most powerful politician in Turkish history. Resurrection and its representational necropolitics had a role in easing in this regime. Characters, music, actors, and other elements from the serial are held up as idealized history on the one hand and brought immediately into everyday life and politics on the other. The generalized message here is of a great nation, but one sinister undertone is the continued prevalence and praise of death in service of the nation. In February of 2016, just over a year after Resurrection's premiere, Turkish soldiers left 2 notes and a 5 lira bill taped to a cabinet in a house they had occupied during the siege of Cizre, a Kurdish majority town in the southeast of Turkey. One of the notes explained, amidst forays into nationalistic and Islamist chauvinism, that the money was compensation for the use of the house. The house had been trashed. It was signed Sungur Tekin, which may have been the soldier's name, but it also happens to be the name of Ertuğrul's older brother in the serial. The other note simply read, "Greetings from the descendants of holy warrior Ertuğrul." The context for the Turkish government's operations in the Kurdish southeast in 2015 and 2016 are complex, as the government was concerned by the rising influence of YPG forces across the Syrian border, as well as an ad hoc autonomy that had been declared by Kurds in various towns in the region in 2014. But the greatest factor was probably electoral defeat. In the hotly contested parliamentary elections of June 2015, the elections which preceded, which were part of the previous example I showed with the tomb raid, the Kurdish-focused HDP had overcome a daunting electoral threshold to enter parliament as a party for the first time, dealing a serious blow to the AKP in the process. Rather than form a coalition government, President Erdogan and the AKP decided to up the ante of nationalist politics, aiming for another vote in November. The Kurds were the go-to enemy. In July, the government began security operations in a number of regions in the southeast. In August, a law was reinterpreted by the government. Basically, as I was saying, there were security operations starting in July of 2015 and continuing throughout early 2016. There were serious curfews. There were all kinds of interventions by the government and trying to get to that slide here. So, sorry, folks, this screen has reset on me here. So I'll continue here. Some key moments provide a brief sense of the operation's macabre nature. In October of 2015, Haji Lokman Birlik, a 24-year-old actor, likely militant, and brother-in-law to HDP MP Leyla Birlik, was summarily executed by police. His body was then tied by a rope to the back of an armored police vehicle and dragged through the streets of Şırnak as a warning to those who might collaborate against the state. Images and videos taken by the officers involved were shared widely on the internet. And I've blurred out the image of the body here, but this is one of the images that was shared. In December of the same year, President Erdogan said that Kurdish militants would be annihilated and that operations would continue until the areas were completely cleansed and a peaceful atmosphere established. In December and January of 2016 were indeed the months of heaviest operations, with numerous accounts of unprovoked killings of civilians, often mediated in highly counterfactual ways by state media. Throughout January, a crisis had been building with numerous people holed up amongst 3 basements in Cizre, and the HDP MPs and others had attempted to intercede with the government and actually believed they had brokered a deal when, on the 30th of January, Turkish forces attacked the basements, killing between 130 and 189 people, many of whom appear to have simply been fleeing other areas of struggle. On the 11th of February, the Cizre operation was declared a success, but the curfew remained in effect while the government bulldozed buildings throughout the area. The curfew was then lifted on the 2nd of March, and the following month, the government issued an expropriation ruling that allowed it to seize property and rebuild large areas in multiple cities throughout through the Mass Housing Administration, or TOKİ, as it's called in Turkey. This included over 30,000 houses, as well as numerous factories, hospitals, and sports stadiums. So some of that damage is shown in these slides, the before and after in Nusaybin and Mardin, in Sur, in Diyarbakir. These are the same areas. And in the slide on the right here, you can see the areas in red in the right-hand slide are areas that were slated for expropriation by the government. So it was a very severe operation. As a final measure, the government passed a retroactive impunity law in June of 2016, making security officers and public officials immune from prosecution for counterterrorism, unless such prosecution is specifically approved by political authorities. Estimates suggest that approximately 2,000 people were killed in the operations, including over 300 civilians, and that over 6,000 were injured. In addition, cases of torture and forced disappearance were documented, and journalistic organizations not closely aligned with the government were forcibly closed. The key elements of Mbembe's Necropolitics are the siege and the state of exception, both of which clearly pertained in the southeast. Likewise with territorial fragmentation, vertical sovereignty, bulldozing, and infrastructural warfare, all detailed by Mbembe. His ultimate conclusion that the state of siege allows a modality of killing that does not distinguish between the external and internal enemy, in which entire populations become the target of the sovereign, is equally applicable. The siege in the southeast took place before the coup attempt facilitated a countrywide state of emergency, exponentially expanding the number of those labeled enemy by the sovereign state, and giving, for those able to and interested in accessing the news, a preview of the lengths to which the AKP would go to maintain sovereignty. The question of who was interested, however, isn't an idle one, because concerns over the operation in the southeast was constructed as a marginal viewpoint, and Resurrection may have had a role in this. The handwritten notes that led this section were left by soldiers almost a year after Operation Shah Euphrates. And because they presumably came from soldiers acting on their own accord, they might be termed productive rather than prescriptive activations of the Resurrection text. But the lines here blur because this was just one instance among many. Social media, such as Twitter, had been used to share pictures of security forces posing with E graffiti. And I call again this flag behind me that comes from the show. And you can see in the images here that same slogan, the IYI, it's not actually an I, but for our purposes, it looks like an I, graffiti throughout throughout areas of these operations. These appeared in Cizre in December of 2016, and similar pictures of forces next to resurrection-related graffiti in other locations appeared in February and May of 2016. The notes in the 5 lira bill, however, became a news item, and they were covered and commented on by reporter Nurcan Baysal in March of 2016. The following month, resurrection actor Nurettin Sönmez, who we saw earlier on coming out at the rally, used the website of a pro-government newspaper to deliver a video message to the security forces in the Southeast, in which he praises their work.
Wow.
So it's set up with this example from the show.
Derviş kardeş. Okumadan da ilim tahsil edilmez mi?
Kardeşlerim, hepinize selam olsun. Cumanız hayırlı olsun. Tüm Doğu ve...
So I don't have subtitles for that, so I'm not going to play the entire message, but he's praising the activities of the soldiers there, telling the soldiers that the actors are trying to represent the kind of bravery that the soldiers are showing in their operations, and wishing them good luck and good health. The message is striking in the context of what had occurred in the Southeast. Once again, a figure from the serial was used to make direct comment on the politics of the moment, but in this case, to sanction and laud the siege of fellow citizens. In the context of a harsh media crackdown, it's plausible that neither Sönmez, this actor, nor his viewers were aware of the extent of human rights violations perpetrated by those he praised. But it's not clear that this would have made a difference, given the extent to which pro-government media had worked to construct Kurds as a terrorist enemy in the lead up to and aftermath of the 2015 parliamentary election. As De Boer has noted on the link between spectacular democracy and terrorism, such a perfect democracy constructs its own inconceivable foe, terrorism. The spectators must certainly never know everything about terrorism, but they must always know enough to convince them that, compared with terrorism, everything else must be acceptable, or in any case, more rational and democratic. And it's in the spectacular mediation provided by Sönmez that we see the dawn of full-spectrum necropolitics, a moment in which the productive and prescriptive activations of the text merge, ultimately leading to a collapse of the distinction between representational and literal necropolitics. So that's the extent of my published paper, folks. But as I revise this research for a chapter in my book on mediating the national past, I'm looking into whether this Turkish necropolitics might be spreading, and doing so at least in part thanks to the influence of resurrection. Twitter is rife with examples of users linking the character of Ertuğrul with efforts for the Islamic Ummah in countries around the world. And I've put a couple of examples up here with links to discussions of Ertuğrul in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Kashmir, etc. Some of these users are quite reflective regarding the way Ertuğrul influenced their interest in such causes. This one literally says, I've come to realize that my growing support for Turkish Operation Peace Spring in Syria is not based on objective research or sound reasoning and can only be blamed on one man, Ertuğrul. So commenting on this influence. The role of resurrection has been particularly outsized in Pakistan, where the show has achieved a huge following, over 10 million followers in this news item from the Turkish news agency. In fact, for the paper that I'm sharing with you today, I can attest to the fact that by far the most people who have downloaded this paper, about half of the 7,000 people who have downloaded it are from Pakistan. So there is great interest in Pakistan in the show. And it may be in part due to this that reports emerged this year that Pakistani mercenaries had traveled to Syria to help out Turkish forces. At the moment, such connections are speculative at best, but they would not be surprising, and I believe they warrant careful attention in a world where Turkish soft and hard power are both on the rise. So, folks, I thank you for your attention, particularly with the upset in the talk there, and I welcome your interventions and your questions. Thanks very much.